Hey folks, welcome back. We are going to be continuing our discussion on consonants. So let me share my screen with you and we will get started on that. Okay. Okay. So what we're going to be talking about in this lecture is place of articulation. Okay. So sorry, my screen is stuck. As we talked about in the last lecture, consonants and vowels are described differently. When we're talking about consonants, we're talking about a constriction in that supralaryngeal vocal tract. So, as first part of the deeper dive into consonants is place of articulation. So, um, often we're talking about place of articulation as speech therapists. This is where we're really giving placement cues for children to help create the sounds correctly. So we may tell them, put your tongue on the bumpy part of the roof of your mouth. So telling them to put their tongue on their alveolar ridge to make a sound that is in the alveolar placement. Or we may say, put your top teeth on your bottom lip. So if they're making a sound like f or v, or we may say, pucker your lips if they're making a b or a p sound. So um, place of articulation is important to us as future speech therapists because that's basically the cues that we're giving kids what to do with their articulators. Okay. So we have active articulators and then we have passive articulators. So um, everybody make the t sound. Okay, now make the f sound. So you could, first of all, you could see sort of what's happening with my mouth, but you can feel it in your own mouth when you make those sounds. So you feel the your tongue rising towards the alveolar ridge behind your teeth, but you actually have to have your teeth kind of resting on that lower lip to create that friction for that sound, right? So when we talk about place of articulation, just a reminder, that's the horizontal axis of our IPA chart. Um, I really like table 5.1 in the textbook in this chapter. I think it's a good resource because it includes keywords to help you remember for the sounds and their place of articulation. So I think that's a good one to help learn it and memorize it because you have to memorize this. So um, as I just said, we're talking about place here. So bilabial, labiodental, dental, etc. All of these places, again, it's either articulators or our lips, our teeth, the alveolar ridge, the hard palate, soft palate, also known as velar, and then the glottis. Okay, so um, we could really get into very fine detail talking about the articulators, so the different parts of the lip. Labial is always referring to our lips. So when you see bilabial or labial sounds, that's referring to our lips. But then there's different parts of the tongue. Um, don't get too bogged down in this because as you could see, when we're talking about place, um, we're using more high level terms. We're not going into the fine detail of all these different phonetic descriptions. So this is just here for your reference as you're reading through the chapter. Okay. All right. So from your textbook, these are the terms that you are going to have to be familiar with. So as you could see, and I talked about this in the last lecture, these terms of placement are following our articulation structure, right? So interdental, um, talking about your teeth, alveolar, alveolar ridge, the hard palate, all the way back to the soft palate, right? So this is a view as if you had your mouth open, and then you could also be looking from the front to the back of the mouth from the side. Okay. All right. So Our tongue is one of our main moving articulators, right? And our lips. But then we also have passive articulators. Um, they do not move, but they're part of our articulation structure. So our upper lip, um, our upper teeth, uh, the alveolar ridge, the palate, both hard and soft palate, your glottis, and then your jaw. So your jaw tongue movements, such as dental, alveolar, and palatal, but then other sounds, our jaw doesn't really move very much. So, for example, the velar sounds that we make. Certain types of speech therapy that you might learn about later on. So there's several different types of speech therapy which really focus a lot on jaw placement. We're not going to get into that in this class, but if you ever have heard of prompt therapy, you learn a lot about the jaw and jaw stability and how it assists in sounds. But for our purposes, we're really going to be focusing on the articulators that move, but this is just so that you're aware. Okay, so as we just mentioned, if you look at the consonant chart, it is organized along the vocal tract. So starting with the lips and then moving back towards the soft palate. We talked about the supralaryngeal vocal tract in our first class. It's just a reminder. When we're talking about place of articulation, we don't necessarily refer to everything in this diagram, but it's just good to kind of know, where things are located. Same for this. Some of these terms you are going to have to know as place of articulation, and we don't, again, go into detail on, for example, retroflex. So when we talk about the R sound, we will talk about this as a tongue position, but it's not a standalone place of articulation. So if you look at the International IPA chart, they kind of organize the sounds along these major places of articulation. So labial, referring to the lips. So bilabial sounds are p, b, m, and w. Do not worry about this upside down W. That's a dialect difference, and even as the book mentioned, we don't typically see it, so do not worry about it. You're not going to have to transcribe it. Labiodental is the sounds where you could see my upper teeth and touching my lip. Dental is where your tongue is going kind of behind those front teeth, but moving out a little bit. So thigh and thistle. You can see my tongue protruding right from my teeth. Alveolar, most sounds are alveolar, so these are very important, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we go through this. Alveolar sounds, t, d, s, z, n, so those are all alveolar sounds, and you can see examples of the words here. Oh, actually, that is not an that's the tap. I apologize. We'll get into the tap later. It occurs in between syllables, like in the word butter, that fluttering sound in the middle, butter, is the flap. Okay, palatal is sh, j, j. Now we're talking about the R sound, and yeah. Okay, so moving back from alveolar back towards the palate. And then we actually refer to these back sounds often when we're teaching them to kids, is the k and the g and ing. And what actually has a couple of different descriptions. And we'll talk about it in a little bit more detail, but it has really two positions we talk about with but I'm not going to get into that detail right now. The glottis, the glottal stop, Um, we don't use this too often, but if you think of uh-oh, you could feel that way, way back, right? In your glottis. Uh-oh. Okay. So just so you can kind of see how this fits into sound development, okay? So when we're talking about sound development, um, there's been a lot of, I don't want to say controversy, but a lot of discussion about um, articulation norms. So this research by McLeod and Crow came out in 2018, and these are really considered the most up-to-date sound milestones. And I'd say that the discussion about it was because these were very different than some previous research that people had been using for years, which had some of these sounds at later points of time. But most speech therapists are now using these sounds. So I just wanted to point it out to you because you could see that a lot of these sounds, so p, b, m, right? These bilabial sounds come in very early. And if you think about it, they're very visual sounds, right? So we can see someone's mouth making those sounds versus sounds that are harder to visualize, okay? So it's just something to consider. Um, just thinking about, sound development of young children. Um, Sometimes when we refer to sounds as speech therapists, you'll hear people say the early, the mid, and the late sounds. So early is often these stops. So I was just giving examples of some of them, p and b, for example. Nasals is the and m, and ing, and then glides. So um, a sound like w is an early developing sound. And then the mid sounds, which come in during preschool years, are affricates, liquids, and fricatives. So looking at these next two age levels up, you'll see some of those sounds. And then late would be the interdental fricatives. So that's the sounds. Okay. Don't worry about this too much, but I just wanted to kind of put some of this terminology in a framework of development. Okay. So another thing to think about with sounds is it's not always neat um, because there's something known as co-articulation. So we're not often making sounds in isolation. We're making them in words and sentences, right? So where sounds are in a word, uh, the adjacent sounds can affect how we produce them. So for example, the n sound, um, it's going to sound a little bit different if it's produced next to an interdental fricative, so in the word tenth, right? So we kind of anticipate what other sounds are in the word, and our articulators are moving to anticipate those other sounds. So another example is, so for the k and the g, these back sounds, the adjacent vowels, and your book mentioned this, can affect where your tongue lands. So if you say the word ki, and then you say the word ku, you could feel your tongue is in a very different place because you're accommodating that front vowel in ki and, the back vowel in ku. And this is important because when we're picking targets for therapy, we want to pick what's easiest to say. So it might be easier for children to produce a sound if it's paired with an adjacent sound that's produced in the same part of the mouth, right? Rather than having to make a big articulation transition there. Okay. We also sometimes co-articulate sounds when we're saying them in a phrase. So we don't often say what's up. We say what's up. And if you want to see a funny commercial, I think it was from the 80s, about all the different ways that people say what's up. You can watch that just to break up the monotony. Okay. So just a couple of other things to note is we're really only worrying about standard American English, IPA consonants right now. But you should be aware that the IPA is an international phonetic alphabet. So it may look different if you look at the IPA in its entirety versus what we're going to focus on in this class. So don't get too bogged down if you look at that big chart and you're like, wait a second, because we're really only focusing on that simplified chart. Okay. Just also to kind of tie this into clinical terms. When we talk about placement, we're often talking about phonological processes. So phonological processes occur when children simplify how they produce sounds in development because they're still learning sounds. However, these simplification processes and substitution, sometimes it's a substituting one sound for another, sometimes they're leaving a sound out. We expect them to resolve in typical development. So, for example, there's errors called velar assimilation and labial assimilation, where if there's a labial sound in the word, the children will just put another labial sound in. Assimilating meaning that that one sound influences another sound in the word. And this typically resolves before children turn 3 years old. Fronting is when they make those back sounds and go too far forward in their mouth, in the front of their mouth. And these are very typical errors that kids make. If they don't resolve, then often that's what we're treating when these kids get to preschool. Then there's other errors which take longer to resolve. So gliding is when we're substituting a glide for a sound that is not a glide. And that's a frequent error pattern that we are treating in speech therapy for school-age children. Stopping, very common for young children to replace sounds with stop sounds. Stop sounds are those early sounds that we talked about, like put and buh. Kids will often substitute those for other sounds when they have an articulation disorder. Okay, so that's it for placement. We're going to move on next to talk about manner on the IPA chart. So I will see you guys in the next lecture.